So for this particular EdPuzzle, we're going to look at how the structure of communities changes over time, going, for example, from an open meadow to a mature forest, and what exactly succession is, and the difference between primary and secondary succession. And then we're going to focus mainly on nutrient cycling, how energy and nutrients enter communities and ecosystems, and how that energy and nutrients are cycled through different levels of organisms until, of course, things die, and how those nutrients get recycled into the next generation of organisms. It's tempting to view communities, right? So groups of populations of different species living together and interacting with each other. It's tempting to look at those as being static over time, right? So the players are always the same. And the only changes that we see are the result of competitive exclusion or those kinds of processes that lead to or changes in populations that lead to local extinction over time. When in reality, the structure of a community actually does change over time, and that is true in terms of both species composition, and the changes in species composition also often lead to structural changes to the habitat, sometimes itself, but certainly to the living community. So when we talk about succession, really we're talking about how these changes in which species are living in a particular habitat in a particular area over time, how those changes occur. And what usually happens is you have the players in the community change in a somewhat predictable way over time. And these changes are usually tied to changes in the vegetation community. So the primary producers, the species that are bringing energy into the particular ecosystem. For example, we've just been talking in class about fire ecology and how certain communities are adapted to a particular, what we call a regime of fire, meaning that they expect fire and have adapted to fire occurring at particular intervals. Typically it's every summer, but it may be less often than that, or it may be more often than that, depending on the community. And those fires tend to essentially reset that community to an earlier successional stage. So primary succession, you're talking about a completely, essentially lifeless area. This is meaning that you just have bare open rock in the case of terrestrial ecosystems. In the case of aquatic ecosystems, this is really, really, really rare. But somehow find a surface that doesn't have anything living on it. So no anemones, no algae, no bacteria, no nothing, right? Because you can imagine primary succession conditions are not terribly common, right? Let's just take the case of terrestrial ecosystems. Easiest examples to come up with a primary succession would be, for example, a glacier that's retreating and essentially scouring the landscape, and all that's left behind is bare rock. It's been covered in ice for so long, there's nothing living on it. There's no bacteria, there's no nothing, right? And so this is essentially a blank slate for other organisms to move in and start setting up shop, right? So the initial colonizers in primary succession are generally going to be our single-celled organisms first. We're going to see the bacteria first. We're going to see single-celled eukaryotes first. We're going to start seeing multicellular eukaryotes first, but typically they're going to be lichens, which I mentioned is a symbiosis between a fungus and an algae. And lichens are important because they basically have little tendrils called hyphae that they send out from the body of the organism to essentially absorb nutrients from the environment. But those little tiny tendrils are good at getting in between spaces and essentially breaking down solid rock and starting to create soil. Moss also helps with this process. And then once you have soil, right, then you could have some, again, you have a total soil community, right? You may even have some animals living in there, quite possibly. You've got some changes in the nutrient availability that then allows plants to move in, right? So usually annuals first. So things that are generally selected type of plants, like mustard weed, right, or dandelions, those kinds of things. Those plants are then going to give way to perennials. So the perennials start moving in, and these are plants that survive for multiple years, either the same body organism or that they reseed themselves every year. And they also will be changing the soil community. Perennials tend to be in general taller than annuals, so they essentially will shade out the annuals and outcompete them for sunlight. The shrubs take longer to get established, but eventually they will shade out the perennials, right? And then if conditions allow, you may even have trees move in, and they take considerably longer to grow, but eventually they will shade out most of the shrubs and the perennials. So this particular process of primary succession can take an extremely long time. This can be, again, thousands of years in some cases. And the reason for that is generally you are starting from really kind of bare bones conditions where you have just bare rock, like I was saying, nothing living on it. So the living things have to get there, and then you need to have a change in the community such that you now have something that can break down that bare rock and convert it to soil. And that's really the bulk of the process, is these early stages that take so much time because you have to go from solid rock to actually soil. So here you can see this third stage here, smaller annual plants and lichen. So again, you have the lichen. Now you've had soil forming because the rock is getting broken down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. And once you have living things in there, they're going to die, right? And so you're going to have this dead organic matter that can be broken down further and recycled. Essentially, you have fertilizer for that soil, which allows other organisms to move in, and so on. And then you can see over time this kind of predictable transition from annual plants to perennial plants to now I've got a mixed community. And notice I have sort of a mixed different kinds of trees. I've got hardwoods and I've got, which are flowering plants. And I have conifers here, which are gymnosperms, as we're going to look at later on. And then I have my climax community, what's also known as a late successional stage community. For any given habitat, the overall community structure in terms of where it's located will always or should always be the same climax community. So what I mean by that is any place where you typically have mixed hardwood conifer forest, that's going to be your late successional stage climax community. You're not going to have oak woodland suddenly instead in that same location, right? So the players will essentially advance and change predictably over time. And you may get some changes in terms of which specific species are present because of local changes in the habitat. For example, you have a new species moves in from someplace else, you have a founder event, and so on. You may get small changes, but overall you should have the same, okay, I'm an early successional stage oak woodland versus a late successional stage oak woodland. And I'm not having oak woodland suddenly becoming, tropical rainforest habitat, right? And those two things are not going to coexist in the same location at the same time. So in general, this is a process that takes an extremely long period of time, primary succession, because you have to create soil from bare rock, essentially. So with secondary succession, you're essentially resetting the community back to an earlier successional stage, but you don't have to start over. You don't have to start from scratch because you, generally speaking, in the case of terrestrial ecosystems, you have soil. You have essentially a portion of the community has survived some sort of a disturbance or event that has removed a large portion of the existing community, and again reset it to an earlier successional stage. But you have that soil community, and if you have that, then you have the nutrients available. You should have seeds from different kinds of plants that can now germinate because there's sunlight and water and other things available to them. And you have those annual plants, coming forth from that. In the case of aquatic communities, this means that you have a source of algae or animals, other community members, so for example, in a nearby geographic area that can then disperse and colonize this new open habitat. Or you have organisms that are floating by in the plankton. They're floating through the water in their larval stage, or some early developmental stage, and they're just looking for a place to kind of settle down and call home, really. So the big difference here between secondary succession and primary succession is the fact with secondary succession, you don't have to start over. And so therefore, it's a process that generally takes a lot less time compared to primary succession. So for example, this one example of this might be when we were talking about the eruption of Mount St. Helens. And we were talking about how what we got out of the mountain was not liquid rock, but it was rather hot volcanic ash. And volcanic ash is very high in organic nitrogen and phosphorus. So you essentially have fertilizer raining down on the surrounding countryside, the surrounding habitat, which of course has been scoured by the electromagnetic pulse, and so you've knocked over all the trees and you basically killed everything that's above the soil and you've buried it in ash. Now, in a couple of years, right, as it rains and so on, the water's going to make its way through that ash and essentially create little pockets and holes. And water getting through to the soil means sunlight getting through to the soil, and that means that the seeds of all the plants that are still hanging out in the soil, basically dormant, waiting for conditions to change, this is now their time. This is their time to germinate and start growing, and you're going to get little tiny baby trees that are initially going to be dominated by the annual and perennial plants that they're surrounded by, but eventually they'll grow tall enough where they can compete for sunlight, and you essentially have a miniature forest that has popped up. And again, it's going to take probably 50 to 100 years and possibly a little longer to fully recover, but that's a lot shorter time than, say, several thousand years. So here, for example, is a fire that's come through, and so you had a major disturbance. It's removed a large portion of the above ground community, but you still have the soil community intact, right? So you still have the bacteria, the seeds, worms, other soil members that are hanging out in there, and you can essentially regenerate your above ground community one of two ways. One is those seeds germinating and giving way. You have annual plants first, generally, and of course we talked in class about how disturbance and an unstable environment tends to favor an R-selected life history strategy, so you do expect annual plants to be the first ones to show up and be able to take advantage of the suddenly open community because they can grow very, very quickly and kind of take over the community, but eventually they're going to be outcompeted by other species, and that means we're going to have a change in our community composition over time as we go through those successional stages again. You can also have colonizers come from intact habitat outside of the disturbed area, as we were talking about before. And those colonizers that come in, the species that arrive, can either inhibit succession by leaving toxins in the soil or by removing nutrients from the soil, depending on the species, or they can actually facilitate succession and make it easier for essentially the next cohort of species to move in to the area. So, for example, we talked about facilitation, right? We talked about our perennial plants, in particular, our legumes, right, that have that relationship with rhizobacteria. And these are bacteria that fix inorganic nitrogen, which is just N2 gas, right? They convert that to an organic form that plants and other living organisms can absorb and use in their cells as building blocks for protein and DNA and so on. So by having this relationship, they tend to build up the presence of these legumes in these communities tends to build up the available nutrient load essentially in the soil, and having all that extra organic matter and especially organic nitrogen makes it easier for your next cohort of plants to move in. For example, the shrubs, it sort of gives them a kickstart, and they can grow more quickly in areas where you've had that facilitation occur as compared to areas where you haven't. So what this means on a landscape scale is you essentially end up with, and typically you combine the disturbance with patterns of succession, you end up with essentially like a mosaic of habitats that are in different successional stages. So we have on the right-hand side the picture, you can see we've got some freshly burned areas. They're even still a little bit black and scorched here. So these are areas that would be great for your annual plants to come in and colonize, and they probably will before the end of the year. And then you have some intact sections of a later successional stage. This is probably not a climax community, but maybe somewhere in the middle, where you have some trees and some large shrubs. And I can see what looks like maybe climax community here in the back of the photo, where it's amazingly the very dark green of those very tall trees. So because you have disturbance that occurs at different times in different areas, and then you followed by this predictable pattern of succession, then you essentially, like I said, you get a landscape that's kind of looks like a patchwork quilt, really. The photo on the left is the Big Sur coast here in California, and so you can see some open areas down here that actually kind of looks like Hearst Castle right there. I'm not sure if it is or not, but there's kind of an open meadow here that would be something that's a very early successional stage, and then you have some much more mature forest up on the top of the hill, and then you've got other things that are in between. As you've had fire, landslides, other things that have come through that have reset those communities to their earlier successional stages. So where do the nutrients and the energy for living communities to grow and develop, where do those things come from, right? The nutrients generally start their lives in an inorganic form. So remembering that organic just means that it has carbon. So some sort of process though has to convert it from something that's inorganic to something that's organic and can be used by living things. And then of course you have to be able to absorb that and use it as building blocks for, as I mentioned, making protein and making DNA and so on. We're going to revisit a little bit more later on where we think possibly the first cells came from that sort of jump-started this whole process. But in general, nutrients are going to be coming from broken down organic matter or coming from conversion from an inorganic source like nitrogen gas, for example. And then the energy to power everything, for us anyway, is coming from the sun. And it's being converted through the process of photosynthesis to biomass. This is basically living matter, organic matter. And so that organic matter generally is storing up energy in the form of chemical energy like glucose, for example, or cellulose, some sort of a molecule that is storing the energy from the sun and that we can use eventually it will release that energy through different chemical reactions, and we can use that energy to build protein and build DNA and divide cells and grow and all that good, reproduce, all that good stuff. So originally, right, all the energy for all life on the earth comes from the sun. And so here we basically just captured a brief look. Don't worry about memorizing any of this stuff. Areas, basically habitats where we expect to see really high primary productivity, basically that conversion of sunlight to organic material. So areas where we have a good photic zone, right? So an area where there's maybe a good amount of nutrients available for those organisms, algal beds and reefs, pretty high in the primary productivity zone. Tropical rainforest, also extremely high in primary productivity. That makes sense. Swamp and marsh, also quite high in primary productivity. We're going to revisit that here in a minute. Estuaries, these are aquatic habitats that are a mix of saltwater and freshwater. So basically something sort of like a bay where you have a freshwater river flowing into it, and you're getting all kinds of mixing of the different kinds of water and temperatures and salinities in there. Temperate forest has decently high primary productivity. The things that we are not surprised when they're really, really low, right? Desert, way down here, right? One of the things you need for photosynthesis is water. What do you not have a lot of in the desert? Water. So that makes sense in that situation. The open ocean is actually surprisingly low in primary productivity. And of course, that's the result generally of the depth of that photic zone, right? The limit to which light can penetrate, which we're going to revisit that here again in just a second. Tundra and alpine, also fairly low. You're at the poles, so you're going to be lacking in sunlight for a large portion of the year, and then what water you have, most of it's going to be frozen. So also something that's going to interfere with primary productivity. So most light that hits the earth actually does not fall on organisms that are doing photosynthesis. Most of it is either reflected right back out into space by the atmosphere, or it's absorbed by and scattered by clouds and dust and other things in the atmosphere. So again, it goes off in all sorts of different directions, and a bunch of it goes back out into space. A good chunk of the remainder falls again on areas where there's either nothing living or nothing that's doing photosynthesis. So open, bare, basically bare rock, ice, something that, a surface that doesn't have organisms doing photosynthesis, right? Of the light that does reach those organisms, only certain wavelengths can be used. So chlorophyll A and B, for example, absorbs very high energy, so wavelengths in the blue range, not ultraviolet, but just below that, so high energy visual spectrum, and very low energy, so in the red, not infrared, but above that, in the red wavelengths. It does not use generally the yellow and green portions of the spectrum. So we see green when we look at something doing photosynthesis with chlorophyll A and B because the green wavelengths are reflected back to our eyes, and so that's why we perceive those surfaces as green. So really only about 1% of the light that hits the planet is actually converted to organic material. And as it turns out, that's still an enormous amount of energy. And that's energy that should be available to other living things, but we have to take into account the cost of living, essentially, for our photosynthesizers themselves. So for the organism, the cost, basically how much of that energy that they convert, that they use for themselves, they use for their own growth and reproduction. If they're using it for themselves, they can't pass that energy on to other organisms. So it's not the gross primary productivity, right? It's going to be the net. This is sort of like if when you get your paycheck, right? You have your gross pay, which would be however many bucks an hour you get paid times the number of hours. That's your gross, but right? Then there's taxes, right? Who's FICA and why does he get all my money, you know? So you take the taxes out. That's the cost of doing business, essentially, that we're accounting for here. So we're taking away how much energy is used by the organisms themselves that are doing the photosynthesis, and then the net primary production, whatever's left over, that's the energy that's available for transfer to other organisms, right? To your herbivores and to your carnivores and so on. So what limits how much primary productivity we expect to see in a particular habitat? Limits, of course, are going to be based on what's required for photosynthesis. So that's going to be light and water in general. In terms of the growth rate of our photosynthetic organisms, they're going to be limited by the availability of nitrogen, organic nitrogen, and organic phosphorus, right? Those things that they can't make for themselves, and this ties into when we were talking about upwelling. And how upwelling is such good news for our primary producers because it's bringing up from the bottom all of that organic material that's so rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, all the things that they need for cell division and DNA replication, but they can't make for themselves. Now they can fix the energy though from the sun. So assuming that they have enough light and enough water. So again, we expect higher primary productivity in areas that are generally wet. So tropical rainforest, for example, temperate rainforest, habitats that get a decent amount of rainfall. Where we expect it to be lowest, of course, are where we have very dry conditions and cold conditions, or dry and hot in terms of terrestrial habitat. So terrestrial productivity generally limited by temperature, cold, of course, being you've tied up all of your water as ice, so it's less available. And of course, the availability of water is a limit to terrestrial primary productivity. Notice that light is not on that list, right? So there's lots of competition for light, but there's nothing really that's preventing light from reaching the surface of the planet. Or they're reaching the soil, other than living organisms that are in the way, capturing the light. You notice that light though is limiting for aquatic primary productivity, and again this has to do with the depth of the photic zone. So basically you're limited by the ability of light to penetrate water. So basically, deeper than about 75 meters, you're not really getting a good amount of available light. And so anything above that is going to be your photic zone, and below that is going to be your aphotic zone. Again, you have things living in the aphotic zone. They're just not doing photosynthesis. So where do these limiting nutrients come from? We've already talked about the process of upwelling and how this brings basically recycled nutrients up to the surface. You can get situations where living systems can, like bacteria and so on, can convert inorganic forms of nitrogen and phosphorus to organic forms, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a second when we look at nutrient reservoirs and where nutrients are stored. But in all honesty, most of the organic nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus that are out there, are being freed up because decomposers are taking dead things and breaking them down and freeing out into their component pieces. And that means that those limiting nutrients are then available for use by primary producers and other living things. Now, the rates of decomposition, we're generally talking about, there are lots of different kinds of organisms that do decomposition, fungi and so a lot of insects and so on. But the bulk of decomposition is being handled by bacteria. And in most cases, these are aerobic bacteria. You do have anaerobic bacteria that are decomposers. They just work a lot more slowly than aerobic pathways for the bacteria or other single-celled organisms. So generally, with what's limiting the rate of decomposition are the things that are limiting the ability of the bacteria to break things down and do their job. So this is generally oxygen. If you're an aerobic organism, you need oxygen. If there's no oxygen, you are not going to be able to break that down, whatever that is. Temperature, we know that all metabolic pathways slow down when it gets colder, right? Adding heat speeds things up to a certain extent. And of course, water. Water is required for pretty much all of our metabolic processes in aerobic organisms. So what this means is if you have habitats where there's lots of oxygen available and it's warm and it's moist without being saturated, you're going to have extremely fast decomposition rates. Sometimes though you have habitats where, okay, I've got water, maybe I've actually got too much water. So where you have soils or sediments that are saturated with water, or sometimes what we refer to as waterlogged, basically there are no little pockets of air or oxygen. It's all either, the dirt or sediment itself and liquid water. There's no pockets of gas, and there's very little dissolved gas in the water itself. So this would be a situation where you may be dealing with a more oxygen limited environment. So you would have organisms doing decomposition, as I said, but they would be using anaerobic pathways in this particular case. So you can sort of have too much of a good thing in a way. And in particular, if the water is warm, you have standing water that's warm, we know warm air holds a lot less of everything, dissolved nutrients, dissolved gases, and so on, compared to cold water. And so if you're deprived of oxygen, or you're deprived of moisture, or it's extremely cold, any of those three things, or a combination of those, you're going to have slower decomposition rates or very little decomposition. Right, we've got situations where you have essentially mummies that have formed because the decomposition didn't happen because the air was too dry and it was cold and so on. So those are all those limiting factors to decomposition. If you have oxygen in abundance, a moist environment but not waterlogged, and warm temperature, then you're going to have really high decomposition rates. So I mentioned again, waterlogged sediments, warm water, you're dealing with oxygen poor situation. If you have wet soil, but that's wet but not saturated, and it's warm, so if warm, that's going to speed up all of your processes, right? If it's wet, you have water, but you're not saturated, so you also have oxygen available, then you're going to have really high levels of decomposition. So for example, we see this in tropical habitats in the soil. Things will basically break down, they hit the soil and they break down within hours. They're completely decomposed. So you have, again, lots of decomposers doing this particular job, but what that means is, in the case of tropics, the nutrients that are available, they become available very, very quickly, and because of the high primary productivity in tropical environments, those nutrients are essentially sucked up by all the living things as fast as they become available. Another possible option in this scenario is that nutrients are leached from the soil. And what I mean by that is they're essentially transported to much lower levels of the soil by the water. So the water's soaking in, and as it is, it's picking up the nutrients and taking the nutrients with it. But again, what we see most often is a situation where you have high primary productivity. That's going to create a tremendous demand for nutrients, those limiting nutrients in particular of nitrogen and phosphorus, such that any nutrients that become available are going to be used as quickly as they are made available, compared to, say, someplace with very slow decomposition rates. Thinking of a wetland, for example, where you have waterlogged sediment, even though it may be, our wetlands experience a lot of primary productivity. So it's warm, I've got my water, but what I'm missing, right, is the oxygen. So the sediments in wetlands, because they're waterlogged, your decomposition rates are very, very slow. And what that means is you have nutrients coming available, but not terribly quickly. And so that's what's limiting your primary productivity. What ends up happening in a lot of wetlands, for example, is, and this is why we refer to them as carbon sinks. You have a lot of carbon that's tied up in that dead and decaying organic matter. It is getting broken down. It's just taking a while because it has to be accomplished through anaerobic pathways. And so the sediments essentially get, you're building up this dead organic matter in there, and that means that carbon dioxide and other things are not being released back out to the environment. They're essentially being locked away in these waterlogged sediments, and when those nutrients do become available, they're being absorbed by the plants that are doing photosynthesis in that particular habitat. So other places where you would expect to see very nutrient poor soil, for example, would be something like a desert, right? Because you've got oxygen, right? It's warm, but you're missing that third factor. You're missing water. So again, this means that your microorganisms that are doing decomposition don't have everything they need, and so anything that is, dead organic matter in the soil is going to break down very, very slowly, and so you're not going to have those nutrients available for everybody to use quite as readily. The same generally goes for your Arctic tundra types of environments, although there it's mostly temperature that's the limiting factor. So as a result of decomposition and erosion, you constantly have nutrients being cycled between abiotic, we refer to as reservoirs, essentially a storage area where you find particular nutrients. They're being moved from those to biotic reservoirs. Basically, they're being captured and used by organisms and stored in biomass. And they're also being moved between accessible reservoirs and inaccessible reservoirs. So in general, for example, organic, basically biomass, organic materials stored in biomass is pretty well accessible, right? It's going to be accessible either through consuming those organisms or breaking them down and freeing up those resources through decomposition, for example. And so in general, so again, that's carbon that's stored there, nitrogen, phosphorus, among others. Depending on what happens to that organic matter, right, it may get used up or it may end up in an inaccessible reservoir. So, for example, I was mentioning the wetlands. You end up with these layers of decaying organic matter that can be quite deep, actually. Peat bogs, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about global change. But they are a type of wetland that's fed by rainfall predominantly. So they are seasonally wet, and then they're also, they dry out basically in the summer. And it's basically a moss is the dominant species in this particular wetland, and they basically break things down extremely slowly. You have very slow decomposition, again because moisture is limiting, and then also oxygen to a certain extent. You get very slow decomposition to where you actually have, for example, mummies that have been found in peat bogs. But the peat layers can get fairly deep and essentially get, the new stuff gets piled on top of the old stuff, and eventually it's buried under these layers and layers and layers. And with enough heat and pressure, you have decaying plant material that eventually gets converted, again through heat and pressure and other factors, to either to basically coal or oil, or as I like to call them, coil. All right. Coal generally are plant deposits. Oil tends to be animal deposits, but basically dead, decaying organic material that's been trapped under layers of sediment. So this would be an example of an inaccessible reservoir, right? Nothing living can get there except for us, now that we have the technology to drill down through those layers and access that organic material. Likewise, another inaccessible reservoir would be minerals stored in rocks. I mean, living things just can't get to it. It's in there, but they can't get to it until you have erosion or weathering, and that frees up some of those minerals, and they get dissolved in water, for example. And then now they're maybe accessible, but whether they're in an inorganic form, so they may be accessible to organisms that can convert from an inorganic to an organic form, or they may be completely inaccessible. It depends on the particular nutrient. As a general rule, nutrients in air and water tend to be more accessible than nutrients that are stored in soil, specifically. And in the soil, like in the dirt itself, not in the air pockets in the soil, but in the soil itself. And so basically nutrient cycling is all about moving stuff from inorganic to organic, and then of course from inaccessible to accessible reservoirs. So again, a lot of our carbon, for example, we have an inaccessible reservoir in the coal deposits and the oil deposits. An accessible reservoir would be biomass. Nitrogen in particular, about 70% of our atmosphere is made up of nitrogen, but it's inorganic. It's N2 gas. So that's something that's inaccessible unless you are a bacteria that can convert N2 gas to organic nitrogen, in which case it's accessible to you.